actually to start, do you want to tell us a bit about the podcast? So about why you started it and, how you're doing it, what you're focusing on and so on?
Sure. So We Belong is a response to a need that I had since a long time to deliver opportunities, key recommendations to young women that were reaching out to me and seeing all the work that I was doing and be like, how can I do too? How can I do the same? And so I was really looking for a way to, first of all, give them a role model or role models that I myself didn't have when I was younger. And so people that look like me or that are not mainstream broadcasted on media or on politics. And it was a necessity to give a voice to these women. And so I decided to travel and meet these women around Europe that have different stories and different experiences. Some of them are activists, some of them are not, but they all have something special to share and a story that is both unique and at the same time speaks to many women. So it's a podcast that features, I branded it the New Daughters of Europe. It's a catchy way to say that we are also European, people of color, immigrant descent, but it also embodies much more than that. I would say the last Young European of the Year, the new Young European of the Year, she's a Roma woman. And I want to interview her too, because I think that she is European, of course, but she still struggles to face discriminations and recognition and just to be acknowledged as such. And so her voice matters too. And so We Belong is just a space where every person that doesn't feel included enough has a platform to speak.
Amazing. Thanks so much for the intro. So we have all of the speakers here now.
Great.
Thanks for sticking with us, everyone. It's the first time we do a webinar, so the Zoom call was a bit hard to get started. Amazing. So Yasmine and Daouii, thank you so much for joining. I'm really, really happy to have you both online with us. I'll just introduce very quickly the event. So we are doing with now a series of digital townhalls with the idea that we want to hear from citizens, experts, politicians, advocates across the world on key, and one of them is on women's rights and the idea that we have more women in power across the world. Pandemics affect women across the world. I can just give you a very quick number. I'm from France. In France, in the first week of the lockdown, domestic violence went up by 32%. 32%. And those are underestimated cases because obviously when an abuser is in the house, it's harder to be able to call a hotline or now to text a hotline. And the sad thing is we knew that those things would happen. After Ebola, after Zika, we saw an increase in domestic violence. We know that women tend to be more affected economically, in their rights, in their safety across the world during a crisis. And so we think it's especially key to speak about gender in the midst of this crisis. We think it's especially key to have more women representatives, more women at the forefront of change right now. And so I'm thrilled to have you both here to be able to answer some of the questions we got from the audience and to hear your take on all of this, to kind of, tell us what you think. So to quickly jump in the intros, I want to let you introduce yourselves. I think you'll be way more capable because I can't do justice to everything that you both have done. I just want to add a little challenge to it. If you can, while telling us a bit about you, explain why you think, in just a couple of words, that women right now in power and women at the forefront of change are important in the midst of this crisis. And I think we can start with Daouii, just because you haven't spoken yet, to just tell us a bit about you.
Thank you, Colombe, and thank you for hosting and inviting me. It's a privilege to be able to speak with you guys today, and I'm super excited for our call. To keep it brief, I work at the intersectionality of geopolitics and finance. Super interested in seeing how we could leverage capital and technology to enact effective change globally. I have experience in capital markets, trade, finance, and communications, and looking forward to kind of build upon those foundations and in the future run a tech firm focused on women entrepreneurs. but currently I work at a fintech company. So just from there to here, why I think there should be more representation in women in power. It's quite simple. When there's conversations happening at the table, there needs to be different perspectives. And when we lack gender parity, oftentimes the perspectives that are much needed by women go on the back burner. And it's not to say that male politicians aren't doing a good job or that we need to change their slots with women. It's recognizing that there needs to be different dimensions and different angles that need to be examined when we're looking at holistic approaches and well-rounded approaches to policy and to building a more cohesive and sustainable world.
I mean, I couldn't say it better, even if, I tried with all of the members, and I think we already see in the chat that people are completely agreeing with you. So thank you for sharing. Yasmine, do you want to tell us a bit about you? And I know that you've been working a lot on having more women in peace building processes. So how you can also link this a bit to just women in power in general.
Okay, great. Just to introduce myself, I'm the co-founder and host of We Belong, which is a podcast featuring immigrant women across Europe. And I'm also an advocate for women's rights and their role in leadership and peace building too. I was working with the United Network of Young Peace Builders before, and working on the recognition of young people and women in peace building processes. And as an advocate for women's rights, I would say that the main focus that I want to stress is that when women are in politics, not only the policies that they will address will be more diverse and more inclusive, but even it's proven by statistics that the healthcare and the focus on healthcare improves in a country when a woman is in power, when a woman is in the cabinet of a government. And so the numbers are there, but the facts are still not. And so we don't see enough gender equality. Until we don't, we can't really expect an improvement in our society, especially after a crisis like this. And especially in this, it's a very it's a momentum that we have to seize the opportunity and address it correctly, because otherwise, and for an additional burden will be on the shoulders of women, which will be being excluded and being even more affected economically and socially. And as you mentioned, domestic violence is a big burden too that women are currently facing as we speak.
Completely. And I mean, you just mentioned the healthcare system, where I think you have in the healthcare system globally 70% of over 70% of women working, and people in leadership positions in the global healthcare system are 72% men. So I think that's also just reflects a bit what you were mentioning. And talking about health, I mean, coronavirus is obviously at the forefront of the news of every media outlet every single day, and we talk a lot about the health implications. I mean, I know, Yasmine, that you're right now sitting in France. Every day we see the death tolls rising and so on. In London, where Daouii you are, I mean, the Prime Minister is now in the hospital. We tend to focus a lot on the healthcare aspect, which none of us are healthcare professionals here, so I'm not sure, it would be the best use of our time. What I want to hear from you is also, what other aspects do you think coronavirus has? Is it only a healthcare crisis? Is it only a health crisis? Or is it also an economic crisis? And how are women especially impacted by it?
So the result of the corona implications is the most significant we've seen since the Second World War, and the extent of its consequences are yet to be actualized. We've seen disruptions in all parts of the economy, but more importantly, as a society as a whole, it is first and foremost a public health crisis, but we don't live our events in silos. Everything is interconnected. Public health becomes economic crises, which turns into geopolitical crises, which becomes, on the micro level, it's become a human crisis, and people are being confined to their homes, people are losing their jobs, and there's a larger mental health crisis also that hasn't been addressed or talked about as much as it needs to be. So as much as it's a public health crisis first and foremost, it extends into every aspect of our human existence. And for women who oftentimes carry the burden of a lot of the domestic household chores, this has exacerbated their workload. Children are now home from schools in many parts of the world. Parents aren't working. And then the elderly care also, which often falls on the burden of females, is exacerbated. So women, I think, have bared the cost of the coronavirus at far greater length and far greater length than it's studied, and different sectors. Sorry, we need to examine the different sectors that's been implicated, and also looking at the gender ratios in those sectors. Right, women, there's hospitality and tourism has been impacted, travel and leisure has been impacted, childcare, education, all of which where women represent a larger portion of the working demographics. So that's kind of my take on, it's not just a public health crisis, and more so how women are impacted. And moving on later, I'd love to touch on more on how women are impacted and giving you guys stats and figures to really highlight and show how we are as women at the forefront of this.
Definitely. I mean, do you want to share some of them right now, since you're talking about it?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself again. Sure. So according to the International Labor Organization, pre-crisis, global female labor participation rate has been declining in the last 2 decades, despite growth in emerging and developing countries from 51.3% in 2008, we're now at 48.5%. And the trend has been exacerbated with this pandemic by the global layoffs that we're seeing. Moreover, in a majority of the global south, for lack of better description, women don't actually make up a lot, work in the economies, but aren't in the formal economic sectors. So they're either working part-time jobs or in the informal labor sector. And according to the UN Conference on Trade and Development, in many parts of the world, women operate in either agricultural jobs or in the informal employment. For example, in South Asia, 80% of women in non-agricultural jobs are in informal employment. The number is 74% in sub-Saharan Africa and 54% in Latin America and the Caribbean. So even prior to this crisis, women entrepreneurs have also faced greater challenges in terms of access to capital and credit. And as we can see with government stimulus packages, access to credit is the difference between surviving this crisis and going under. So globally, these figures show itself, and this is pre-crisis. Post-crisis, we're going to see an exacerbation of this. Moreover, I'd like to touch on government's aid packages have all been focused on the personal level, on people working in formal labor sectors. But women don't account for a large portion of that, and it doesn't take into account the informal sector, nor does it take into account part-time labor. So it's necessary for governments to really recognize that, because although they're trying to do good by putting out stimulus packages, that money isn't reaching the people who most need it.
I mean, thank you for this. I want to also jump to Yasmine for her to answer the question, but it was actually going to be one of my follow-up questions. We saw with, Ebola in the past that women had way harder for them to go back to the workforce afterwards, and that men managed to get back to the salaries fairly quickly, whereas for women it took way more months to do so. And I think it's something we're not considering enough either. But Yasmine, please give us your take as well on the crisis, on whether it's just a health crisis, the specific it has on women and other people.
Well, I echo what Daouii said, but I will also challenge it a bit, because I understand that it's a health crisis, and I understand it's an economic crisis. Of course, it's the worst of the decade. But if we think about, if we focus only about the economics, we're gonna get it wrong. I think that most of all, it's a digital crisis, because we were not prepared digitally, and we are seeing that the real transition, the digital transition, is occurring because we're facing coronavirus, and we have to adapt just now. We didn't prepare it really well before, and so it's a digital crisis that we have to take as an opportunity, but also a social crisis. As you mentioned, of course, it's a burden for women, but I would also like to underline that it's a burden especially for women from underprivileged background, because out there there are still working people that still continue to work on supermarkets, on cleaning services, on these kind of jobs that are the less paid in the society and still today are the more needed. And so, first of all, recognizing that there is an importance, first of all, to protect these people, and not only protecting them physically but also mentally, because they're facing they're at the forefront. They're continuing to work, and secondly, how do we make sure that the model that we have, and that's why I'm really proud to see that in Europe compared to other countries, and I would mention, for example, in the US, we are at least creating some measures to deal with the crisis and to confine people and to acknowledge that economy is just not the first and the main focus, but also the safety and protection of people. Whereas in the US, it's not really the case, and even the access to healthcare, it's not that common. So I think I would just say that, for me, it's a social crisis that we have to take as an opportunity to re-question our economic model, which is not relevant.
I mean, I completely agree with you, Yasmine.
Sorry, I cut you. Do you want to? So the panel agrees.
No, I just completely agree with her, and glad that she touched on the notion of the most at-risk communities within the global female population and the need for greater policy to be able to aid them appropriately.
I mean, this is a perfect transition. We keep on hearing about social confinement, but to such an extent, social confinement is a huge luxury, and we see it all over the world. Those of us, and I think for most of us here on the panel today at least, who can actually afford to stay at home and have a job that enables this and so on, is a huge luxury. People are still working, and apart from, of course, the healthcare professionals that we think about a lot, but all of those, working at the supermarket and so on, that tend to be underpaid for the work they're doing right now, are also taking a huge risk. And this is what you said, Yasmine, in Europe, but then in other countries, like in India, for example, we saw that the government implemented a lockdown so strict so quickly that people were forced to flee on their feet to be able to go back to their villages and died on the road. And we see in New York City that, for example, African-American populations are impacted to a way bigger extent by coronavirus than others, just because of social distancing measures. And so my question for you is, social distancing is a luxury. Clearly, most governments on Earth were not extremely prepared to put in place comprehensive plans to make sure that no one is left behind, because a big part of the population is left behind. And what do you think we should be doing in the future and right now to make sure that this doesn't happen again? What measures do we need to put in place to make sure that no one is left behind and that we can all move forward as one in a way?
I will just mention the example of Italy, which is the first country that was really impacted and that was on the front line facing this, and then the rest of Europe just followed. But in Italy, they really took a long time before declaring lockdown or taking a strict measure, just because they were so afraid of the economy. And so, as I mentioned, the lesson that we have to learn is that the economy sometimes is not the priority, because if we didn't think about the economy that much and we took this step earlier, we wouldn't have had probably that many deaths, So lesson learned, I would say, when there is a crisis, the safety and protection of people is the priority. And then for example, I know that in the Netherlands, where I was living just before coming back to France, they're still it's not a strict lockdown, so people are still going out, just everything is closed, and I'm afraid for them. I mean, I don't know how it will be in the next following weeks, but the way European countries are tackling the issue and responding to it not jointly, first of all, shows it's a real challenge for Europe, shows that the fragility of the union. And second of all, it's very dangerous for the citizens, because the way lockdown is handled in Italy is not the same way it is handled in the Netherlands, for example, or in Belgium. So the measure that are the social distancing that is has been taken sometimes it's not strict enough, and in the future, we should definitely be prepared better by taking earlier measures. But of course, it's easy to say it afterwards than when it's the time and when you are in this crisis and you have to respond.
No, of course, but reacting earlier tends to be better than reacting later in general. Daouii, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think twofold, one of which the failure, for lack of better description, of a lot of Western countries to act sooner was due largely to populism and the rise of nationalism and global skepticism when it came to not only China, but multilateral institutions such as the World Health Organization, and how credible they were with their information. We saw that and we still see that in the US with Donald Trump and his press briefings every day. And as up until 3 weeks ago, Boris Johnson, and kind of how they were handling the situation, not only on the health front, but the messaging they were giving to people. And this social distancing, the mass lockdown, I think was just hysteria and a need to act now and act fast, without recognizing that there's a lot of individuals, particularly vulnerable groups, who don't have the luxury of large, vast houses where everyone can confine to a singular room. Oftentimes, the reality is people share rooms, people share homes. Vast majority of millennials have several roommates, not just one or two. And the recognizing that these situations should have been taken into account when putting in policies to circumvent the spread of coronavirus. Moreover, COVID, I think, has been a recalibration of our systems and how as we as a society function and react to situations. We haven't seen, at least in my generation, anything of this sort, a pandemic of this sort that halted not only global trade and economies, but also how people interact with each other societally. So I think recognizing that there is a large population of people who are now deemed at a higher rate of vulnerability because of COVID. That's women with domestic abuse, not only the workload that they're now taking on, homeless people, as someone mentioned in the comment section, and youth. People who oftentimes lived with their parents and decided to move out and live with friends, and now they're kind of caught in the streets and with nowhere to turn. The prison system is another prime example in the US. They're trying to expedite certain cases where people can serve their sentences at home, but that doesn't eliminate the risk that people in prison penitentiaries face with the spread of corona. And that's one thing we learned with this virus is it's non-discriminatory. It doesn't care about wealth. It doesn't care about race. It doesn't care about socioeconomic status. So I think the lack of global preparedness has shown how fragile our states are. And it's up to us as global citizens, and moreover, as the emerging young leaders, to really call into our politicians and call into question their motives and their actions.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. I see a lot of comments on the chat sections, and I promise that we'll get to it very, very quickly. I just want to kind of take a step back and ask the two of you a question a bit more related to your everyday job before concluding with a question about women in power, and then we'll take all of the questions in the chat, I promise. So just Yasmine, as you mentioned in your intro, and as we said on social media, you worked and you wrote quite a bit about the need to have more women, and especially young women, in peacebuilding processes. And it's, to me at least, it's very clear why this needs to be the case, and why after a crisis we need to make sure that there's people representing all points of view from all walks of life and so on, making sure that we transition towards a better society. I wonder if you could try to make the link for us as well as to why this is needed, why we need women. And I think, that we also touched on the point why we need youth, so young women as well, to be at the forefront of this crisis, to be making policies, to be working on the response to the crisis.
First of all, I would say that as Daouii mentioned, and I will echo it, it's our future, the future of the next generation to come. And so as young people, we are the ones who will be leading the governments tomorrow. And so we, first of all, need to be included because it's something that is affecting us, but also as young women. As you mentioned, 70% of women are working on health and social sectors, and they're still so marginalized when it comes to making decisions for what concerns them. And the same things happens for peace building processes. So in times of crisis, and I would say that even in Europe, we need peace building processes, by the way. We need to make sure that at the table we have people represented that face the challenges that we're talking about. We can't talk about tackling coronavirus, tackling economic crisis, tackling if people coming from underprivileged backgrounds, affected by social economic sectors that will be impacted by this crisis if they're not in the table. How can I understand the needs of a healthcare in the healthcare sector if I don't hear from a doctor, from the nurses? So in France, for example, there is a huge lack of masks, and the health workers are really strained to work and to continue to provide services where they lack of material. So hearing from them is the first step to understand what we need to improve, right? So first of all, it's a need, and second, it's a need for representation. A need to, give the floor and give the voice to the people that are first impacted, particularly young and women in general.
I once more could not agree more. I don't know if Daouii, you want to jump on this one. Otherwise, I have another question for you, which I'll just tell you before, so then you can react to both. You mentioned, I think at the beginning of the panel, the fact that women who often work in the informal sector are not the ones that are being targeted in a way by the stimulus packages done by governments, and that they are the ones often who are the most in need of support and will probably not get it. So, and we also discussed the fact that post-crisis, women it will be harder to go back to the workforce, salaries will be unequal, and they still have accumulated a lot of care duties and so on. So I wanted to hear you take about what we should be doing, what government should be doing to make sure that we kind of remedy this inequality, to make sure that women now and after coronavirus, whenever this is finally over, will be able to have equal opportunities and will not be left behind.
I'll try to touch on as many points as I can, given the two questions. I completely agree with Yasmine on the need for recognizing the people at most risk and also bringing to the forefront a diverse set of experts to be able to tackle the question. She put it perfectly. How can I know what the healthcare sector needs what the healthcare sector needs if I've never spoken to a doctor? So I think what government should do in the future is create an expert panel that is as diverse as its citizens, and also promote a risk analysis of examining which industries and sectors on the economic front are the greatest at risk, and bringing forth individuals to represent the voices of those people, but also bringing together a panel of community members that are most at risk, and bringing voices to be able to address those systemic issues that are necessary and how governments can greater help those communities. It's not just bringing forth the Minister of National Health to lay out a set of policies that haven't really been that don't take into account the greater portion of society. So I think it's bringing together a holistic approach that's multifaceted and bringing in as many diverse voices as possible while carrying out a risk analysis. And to touch on your second question, moving forward, I think, one, we need to prioritize women participation in the labor force post-crisis. And it's not just about increasing women in jobs, but it's also examining the quality of jobs that women are taking. And it's a multifaceted issue, and it's compounding because it takes into account a variety of issues, such as access to education, access to adequate technology in order to work from home or leverage technology to be able to participate in different manners than we previously have seen. But it's steps that we need to take. Second, government needs to look at the demographics of workers in each industry and that have been greatly impacted by COVID, and recognize that most of these employees are female, and put into account adequate policies to better ensure not only that this doesn't happen again, but these women can get back on their feet and get their jobs back, because there's also an uncertainty that a lot of the people laid off aren't guaranteed to have jobs when the economy restabilizes. Also, we need to look at increasing credit lines and access to credit for women entrepreneurs in many parts of the world. We need to recognize that entrepreneurship and innovation will be how their economies flourish. So I think we need to promote that. And we need to adopt new models and systems to better support women, better support hosted communities, and factor in socioeconomics that come into play. And like I said earlier, it goes beyond just saying that we need to increase women in labor force participation. We need to examine the quality of the jobs and also recognize the different aspects that come into play, whether it's access to education, whether it's societal constraints, such as women having to stay at home. I think we have tool of technology, and we need to really recognize how we can leverage it and ensure that we have a sustainable and equitable world moving forward.
And I will just jump into this to also strengthen the importance of partnership. We understood through this crisis that the governments can't do everything alone, and I'm working currently for a scale up, and I'm seeing the potential of startups and scale up and the private sector to just bring into innovation and support governments in dealing with the crisis. There are many hackathons, crisis hackathons that are taking place, initiated by enterprises and companies. And so how can the government collaborate with these companies also outside the crisis to tackle social issues? Because, okay, this is the urgency. There are people dying, but there are also people dying, I would say, for domestic violence. There are also people dying for climate change. And we don't really think about it till it hits on us. You know, like, okay, this is a virus and this is something urgent that we are tackling, but it's also a lesson to learn for the future on how we work, and we need to continue to work in partnership with all their stakeholders.
Really, I mean, thank you for this intervention. This is also another series of events we want to do. It's the lessons learned from COVID-19, and not just looking at the negative, obviously, and how, you know, a lot of missteps happened and mistakes were made, but also what can we learn that we have done more or less well, or what has improved during this time. So we'll be doing other events on this, and I would love to have you then as well to discuss it. However, I have abused my time to ask you questions. I still have a lot, but I'll try to hold back just to be able to take a few questions from the audience as well. So in the chat, the first question I see, and by the way, for social media, Laura, don't hesitate to add the questions to the chat on Zoom, and I'll ask them as well. So the first question from Andrea is, do you think that the crisis will provide this momentum or make it even more difficult for women to lead? So, you know, the subject matter is, for us at now, we need more women in power right now. Do you think that there will be an opportunity for this, or would it be even harder?
Do you want to, I can take it. Unfortunately, and I'm a bit pessimist on this, but I don't think that we will learn much. You know, I think that the main focus will be to, you know, to respond economically to the crisis and to, you know, help the society just standing up again after this fall. But either we really push on it and we demand for a more for a better recognition of women's role. But in a normal set, I wouldn't see an improvement without it coming from us. Like, of course, you don't receive just rights; you have to take them. And I think depending on how impactful this will be on society, and it will be very impactful, but on how women will be responding on this, then we probably see some change. But otherwise, unfortunately, I still stay a bit pessimist.
So basically, we'll need to make sure that our governments act for the better.
So I would like to just push back on that just a little bit. As millennials, we all have had the phrase of, I want to change the world. And I might be a bit optimistic, but I think right now is the perfect opportunity to seize, to push not only our governments towards a policy change, but also recognizing that the systems we were always all told to join and change from the insides have inherently now broken and fallen. And it's up to us to participate in its rebuilding. And I think it's important to recognize that this is just not a one dimensional issue. It's not just the economy that's going to need rebuilding, but it's almost every aspect of our society and how we interact with people. There's huge issues with data privacy and how governments are now basically like a big brother type mechanism, and we don't know where our data is going, and we don't know how we're being tracked and where those data centers are and what people are doing with their data. There is a larger issue on mental health and stigma associated to that. So I think on a larger macro level, there's so much that needs rebuilding or restructuring that as emerging leaders, I think there are possibilities and avenues for our voices to be heard. It takes us to be proactive. No one is going to come to us and say, hey, we have a policy, we would love your opinion on it. I think we need to leverage this opportunity to really drive those changes that we would want to see.
I mean, that's my life philosophy. So I'm very happy you mentioned this, and it's the reason for which we created Now as well, to do a bit of a soft promotion for our organization in the middle. It's the idea that we need to take action and make sure that things change. I think I'll just ask you another question, Daouii, because I know you're from Toronto, right? You mentioned in the introduction. And we nice. We had a question on the chat from someone from Toronto, actually, asking for suggestions on how to help women subject to domestic abuse at home, because a lot of shelters have been closed. So obviously not everyone has answers to everything in life, but I wanted to know whether you had some thoughts on this, considering the fact that this person is asking about Toronto specifically.
So I'm not an expert on that topic at all, so I'm not going to pretend to know how to best help. But what I can promote is, and what I've been doing and a lot of my friends have been doing, is donating to NGOs and clinics and shelters in need directly. There's a ton of organizations, and I believe there's a resource out there that provides a list of organizations providing services to the most vulnerable. If you can't donate, call them and see how you can volunteer your time. I think right now we have to just pool all our resources together and try to help as many people as we can. I know there are GoFundMe pages also, so you can donate from the comfort of your own living room and share amongst your networks. So as much as I would love to be able to provide a solution to that question, I don't think, one, I'm in the expertise, and two, the best thing I know how to do is just donate and promote and share the words of the people that are doing on the ground work who need it the most.
What about you, Yasmine? Have you heard of best practices or anything else?
An expert on this, but of course I've seen many crowdfunding campaigns, many initiatives coming from civil society, and I think it's the best way just to donate and to support the local workers that are the community workers that are doing crowdfunding campaigns.
Perfect. So what we'll do now then is we'll be sharing some crowdfunders. If you want to send it to us in the chat, we'll be sharing on social media after some of the crowdfunders that are taking place to help victims of domestic violence. I can just share quickly some best practices I read on the topic, which is a lot of governments shut down shelters at first, which obviously put a lot of people at risk. And thanks to some petitions and some of the work by local organizations, shelters have reopened in quite a few countries. Obviously with specific measures in place to protect people from COVID-19, but citizens managed to push governments to actually reopen shelters. And when they were not reopened in countries, I think like France, the victims of domestic violence, when they manage to get in touch with someone, can be put in and can be placed in hotels where they're more at safety. So here, once more citizens have the option to push governments to take action and to literally save lives sometimes. But we'll be sharing more resources on this after. And as a last note, we'll be doing another event actually with the director of a domestic violence shelter from the UK, who will be sharing as well her experience and how COVID-19 has really affected the work and women in general. We got another question. So whoever wants to answer it, feel free to go at it, which is COVID-19 is fostering global inequalities with smaller and weaker states and minoritized groups being most affected. So Claudio is asking you what global institutions should do to fight against this outcome. Where should we start? Again, we're not experts on everything, but let's try to reimagine the world. What would you want to see global institutions doing?
Okay. Before saying anything, I would just like to mention that I really believe in the power of young people, and especially civil society organizations, to make change. I just want to outline this point from my previous reply. It's just that unfortunately the responses of government aren't often in line with people's needs, but we need to strike back. And this, for example, the inequality that countries will face in terms of minority groups, but also countries that are smaller or weaker states, as you mentioned. The response, global response that will come and that has to come, has to take into consideration again the voice of the one who are most affected. So when it comes to minorities within states also, because we have to take in consideration not only inequalities between countries, but within countries. How do we make sure the minorities are taken into consideration when the new policies will be drafted and will be written? I see many people from minority backgrounds still out there working and not being socially protected, especially migrants who often have no rights. I'm very proud of Portugal that initiated this policy where they temporarily granted all rights to immigrants, to illegal migrants, as they call them, to get access to healthcare in this crisis. So Portugal took this step, but how about other countries? If a person has no documents, legal documents in a country, and he is affected from coronavirus, how do we protect this? So also, keeping in mind that within country we have a lot to do, and then from the global response, I will let Daouii maybe reply.
Thank you, Yasmine. Just to add to it, I think first and foremost, we need to push back against nationalism and protectionism. We saw earlier this week that Donald Trump tried to ban a company to selling medical supplies to Canada, and the company released a mandate saying that it would not do that. So I think first and foremost, we need to, like I said, push back against nationalism and protectionist policies. And we also need to realize that, yes, this is affecting nations, but it's a global pandemic. We need to work together as one to ensure that any solution is carried out effectively and maintains long-term stability. Moreover, I think international organizations need to recognize why they were initially created and what purpose they serve. So the G20 is in session, and we've heard very, very minimal coming out of Saudi Arabia right now on how to tackle COVID. And it's first and foremost, amongst all else, it's supposed to serve as an economic conference. But when a pandemic like this arises, it should serve as a platform for governments and global leaders to come together and provide a tangible solution like they did post the 2008 recession. So I think global institutions need to recognize that their leadership is needed more than ever. And I think nations need to also recognize that there is a global leadership vacuum. Previously, we oftentimes turn to the United States for leadership, and they've done to their full detriment, I guess, good and bad leadership. And now there's no leadership. So I think global nations need to realize that there's no leadership coming out of the US, and the Chinese haven't been the most forthcoming regarding this virus and how to best tackle it. So they need to come together and kind of fill that void and fill that vacuum. And more on the marginalized countries or communities, there needs to be a recognition that the social distancing or global shutdown might be feasible in Western countries that have very individualistic norms to begin with. But countries such as India, such as the vast majority of countries in Africa, even Latin America, and to a greater extent, Italy also, have a communal society where people interactions are vital and very much central to how people manage their lives and how people live. So I think we need to recognize all those aspects and push on our governments to fill that global leadership vacuum that's left by the demise of the United States.
I think you just did the best speech for our organization now I've ever heard. It's exactly the premises that we are building it on. It's exactly this. I mean, we need global leadership for global issues. It's as simple as this. So thank you for this. We might use it for the future. If I can just add one element here, it's the fact that we need to be sharing best practices as well between countries. I mean, we're talking about Italy. We saw Italy going through the crisis. Our governments, Belgium right now reacted much later. With potentially deadly, results as a result. We saw South Korea adopting a different approach. We seem to have worked, but we didn't try it. We didn't try mass testing very early on and so on. So I think it's also about sharing knowledge and best practices of what actually works. I got a question early on my social media for both of you actually, which is, we talk a lot about health. We don't, for many people, speak enough about mental health. So about the consequences of this crisis on mental health for the sake of this event as well, specifically for women. So whether being confined or being forced to work in sometimes very dangerous situations, what this is doing, what isolation is doing. If you have any take on this and advice in general. Maybe we start with Yasmine. Go for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I was a few months ago in a conference on global education, and there was I met this amazing organization that is providing mental health courses for hundreds of schools, but also teachers. And I think we need this coming from governments, especially for women. We are now using the internet. Those who have the luck to have a laptop and internet at home, we're using this tool as a communication tool and as a learning tool, but it can also be a tool where we can provide this service, which is very important, and it's something that we don't see. That's why we don't think it's it's not an evident need, but it's a very important need, and we can't, like, I would start this brainstorming and say that a training or a service coming from the government online would be, first of all, very good solution, and also so much needed, because right now it's where we most need it, and of course post the crisis, but especially now.
Thank you for this. Sorry, there's a bit of delay in the connection. Daouii, do you want to answer this question as well?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it's recognizing within our societies that mental health is not a taboo, and it's very much real, and there shouldn't be a stigma associated with it. I think post-COVID, we should also push for more mental health access to people, because currently it's based on economics and economic resources, not on a national level, but personal. It's your access to mental health facilities is very much dependent on how much money you make, and if you can get your insurance to pay for it. So that's one. And I think also on the micro, we need to take care of our own mental health first and foremost. Yes, it's great to be in the know-how of everything that's happening with the crisis and keeping up to date with all the news headlines and the statistics, but you might also want to deplug unplug, sometimes, and take care of your own mental health. I did it last week. I just found it a bit overwhelming with everything happening. And I took a couple of days just to unplug and focus on myself and try to create a routine for myself now that I'm going to be working from home and isolated in an apartment. So I think on a micro level, we need to recognize how we can best cope, whether if you research, there's many coping mechanisms available on the interweb. Some people prefer talking, other people prefer bubble baths, depending on what your needs are, putting yourself first. And then on the more long-term, mid to long-term, we need to kind of push for greater access to mental.
Thank you for this. And also for anyone who's struggling, I know that a lot of services, of course it should be done by governments, but a lot of psychologists and coaches and so on are providing free sessions online to help those in need in times of isolation. I have one not fun, it's a very sad fact, but the way it was phrased is a bit of a fun question. Just to conclude before letting you also have a word at the end. Andrea got a question on his Instagram, which is, this is a very sad part, 70% of health workers are women. We only see men on TV. How come we just see male doctors? And what should we do about it? I don't know if you have any answers to this. I know, Daouii, that you're from Canada. You have a lot of women leading the response, from what I saw, at least on social media. So you might have a different take.
Yeah. Just when I published on social media about this conference that we're running today, I had a friend who is also an activist. He replied to me, and he was like, amazing initiative, but just have a question. How COVID explains the need for women to be more recognized in decision-making process? And it's not that evident for people to understand that COVID proved that we need more women in decision-making. So first of all, these facts, 70% of health workers are women, are not put it out there enough. And as you say, also there is no representation on TV, on media, on politics, and at the front line we just see men. And I think this is something, first of all, to criticize, but also to acknowledge and to analyze, to understand that, well, in a patriarchal view, we are in a crisis. We need this strong man that will rescue us. And no, I'm sorry, it's not like this. And so that's what we need to question, the stigma and the assumption that society puts on us. So I think that the most important thing to do is to denounce it, but to denounce it also on media and to ask for better representation. And this should come it has to come from civil society, from people like us that out there on social media will denounce this. And also, very quickly, the day after the lockdown was announced in France, many media initiated this diary of the confined person, and they gave the floor to journalists. And this was very criticized, especially by people that are also on lockdown, that they don't have the luxury to be locked down in their second house, and so they're not, from a wealthy background, and they need to have voice too. So how do we make sure that we represent also these people working on not only health workers and women, but also people working behind the scenes and continue to work despite the lockdown, and how they face the lockdown, how they they deal with it. So yeah, representation is key.
Thank you. Daouii, do you want to add anything to this?
I know we're coming up on time, and I'd love to answer more questions, so just keeping it brief. I think its post is recognizing that we need to go to the ballot boxes more and ensure that the representatives we're voting for reflect the diversity that we want to see in
100%. And this is actually, I think we're going to use this as a closing question, because unfortunately we can't stay longer. There's another meeting on this Zoom link after. which is, the theme of this session, and Yasmine, you talked about it in the last part of your answer as well, is why we need more women in power right now. And now for us, it's very clear, and we have said it over and over and over again, we need all perspectives to be considered. We need people in decision-making positions to be representative, and we need to make it happen all over the world. It's an issue everywhere in the world. There's no country that is completely equal. There's a few countries that have achieved gender parity in politics, but not at every level. So our take has been to start an online petition, a global one, to try to mobilize people around this issue. And we will then present it to national governments and try to organize various actions around this. We seem to all agree on the fact that we need more women. How would you go about it? What would you encourage people to take out of this call? I am a big fan of trying to give a clear action. So mine to people will be to ask you to sign the petition. But what would you ask people to do after this call, straight after, to make sure that we end up with a better outcome next time?
Well, the first thing that I would say, and especially in this time that we have, like, the most powerful mean that we have is social media, is don't stay silent. And this lack of women representation on social media, on media and on politics, we need to tackle it starting from social media. So Twitter, question your governments, question your policymakers. I would say this is the first step, and in a more organized way, sign petitions, of course. But also make sure that you support the initiatives that create spaces for women to speak and to demand their rights. So this is why I'm very, very happy to support the initiatives of now. And I will read the petition, and hopefully I will sign it.
Thank you for this. Daouii, I think there's a bit of delay, but what would be the action you ask people to take after?
One, it would be continue dialogue and conversation. Go beyond the headlines. So as we know, we've become sensationalized with all our headlines, and journalism has now seen a gray area, for lack of better descriptor. So push the storyline beyond the headline and actually seek factual truth. Continue conversations with your neighbors, with your loved ones, with your friends, and critically analyze everything that's happening in the world and take in all perspectives. I think there's an issue that we've become very ideologically polarized, and I think we need to fill that gap, and one way by doing it is to have these conversations and informed conversations. Not everyone agrees with you, but a test of fate of humanity is being able to have a conversation with people who don't agree with you and come to a mutual conclusion on issues. And I would also say support, whether through monetary, volunteering, or any other way you can, support grassroots organizations that are at the forefront, whether it's helping domestic violence, whether it's helping homelessness or food shelters. Those organizations and systems need us more than ever right now because governments have cut funding in a lot of ways. So support as much as you can, and I think we will come out of this stronger. It's just up to us to describe how our systems will look post. And I think fundamentally we need to take charge and create initiatives that we want to see implemented.
Thank you both. Thank you so much for answering all of our questions. Before closing, I just want to mention that we started a poll to see whether this panel has left you more optimistic about the post-COVID era and women leadership, and 100% of participants have said that they will be that they are more optimistic about the future. And so I think this is at least one amazing takeaway, that you have managed to brighten everyone's day in a way, and to make them more energetic and more optimistic. So thanks for all of your answers. It's been amazing chatting with you. I wish we could keep it a bit longer, unfortunately, other events after as well. But thank you so much for coming to this event.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting, and I'm happy to continue the conversation on Twitter for people who still have questions.
Same. Yes. I'm available on Instagram and Twitter, and I'm happy to reply and to connect.
And we are tagging both panelists on every social media. So if you don't know how to find them, go on our social media accounts. We're tagging them wherever they have an account. And thank you, Bettina, for doing the social media. In the meanwhile, Laura for moderating as well. and managing the tech, and Andrea for all the questions you took from social media. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you so much once more.
Thank you for having us. Bye.
Bye.